Am I technically a good enough writer to be doing this kind of video essay? No. Am I still gonna be doing it? Yes. Hi guys, it's Shanae and welcome back to my channel, and today's video is gonna be quite different from my usual reaction based content, but this is a video that I have been wanting to make for over a year now, and like 27 pages and 13,000 words of script writing later, and we're finally here. So I hope you guys will enjoy it. So I know I technically should have waited until I'd finished Scumvillain and had like the physical copy of Heaven Official's Blessing's final volume in my hands, but I have finished Heaven Official's Blessing, I've finished Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, and I just really wanted to do this video to celebrate the fact that we're finally getting season 2 of Heaven Official's Blessing, and I wanted to do this video before we start with the reactions for season 2 next week. So I hope you guys won't mind. Anyway, I've recently been getting back into writing, and that made me wonder, like, what is it that makes Mo Xiang-Tongshu's books as amazing as they are? But also, I just kind of wanted an excuse to simp over her work. And am I technically a good enough writer to be doing this kind of video essay? No. Am I still gonna be doing it? Yes. So with that being said, today I am gonna be attempting to analyze what makes Mo Xiang-Tongshu's writing work as well as it does, and how you could potentially work it into your own writing if you wanted to. However, as I mentioned, I am gonna be working through a script with this video because there's just a lot to be said. So if I start sounding like a GPS giving directions instead of a normal functioning human being at some points, just apologies in advance. And because I don't know how long this video is going to end up being, please refer to the description box if you want to jump around in the video. I'm going to be trying to timestamp all the relevant sections, as well as within those sections each of the individual novels. So if you haven't read Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation but you still want to look at one of the specific sections, then you can just skip over the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation talk so that you don't get spoiled for anything. And also all the links for the novels will be there. And I do want to take a moment to just say a quick and massive thank you to all my amazing patrons and channel members, and if you're interested in joining either of those for early access and uncut reactions to things like the Modao Zushi audio drama, links for that will also be down below. All the things are down below. But anyway, I do want to give a quick background to any passers-by who might accidentally have stumbled into this and want to know what the hell I'm talking about. Mo Xiang-Tongshu, who I'll be referring to as MXTX moving forward, is a Chinese danmei/BL writer who has, as of me filming this video, released 3 books in the like fantasy, supernatural, romance genre: Scumvillain Self-Saving System, otherwise known as Ren Zhao Fan Pai Zhijiu Xi Tong, Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, otherwise known as Mo Dao Zu Xi, and Heaven Official's Blessing, otherwise known as Tian Guan Ci Fu, that became so successful that they weren't only adapted, some of them were adapted into multiple formats, and they were also translated into various other languages, English being one of them, and that is the language that I'm going to be basing my analysis in, obviously, as you can tell from the language of this video so far. But yeah, I did want to clarify that this is going to be solely based on my interpretation of the English text. The original is Chinese, so there might be things that unfortunately are lost in translation, and I will be doing my best to cite where I find all of these quotes in case you want to refer to them in your own copies later on or anything like that. The 3 novels were released in the following order. Scumvillain was released in 2015, Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation in 2016, and the final novel, Heaven Official's Blessing, in 2017. So basically a book a year, which is very impressive considering their length. But because, as you can probably tell if you're not familiar with her work, she likes the long titles, so I'm going to be referring to them as Scumvillain, Grandmaster, and Heaven Officials respectively. I'm going to be looking at the bigger story structure elements, the characters, and the relationships. Considering that her novels don't tend towards a normal 3-act structure, I thought it would be more helpful to just look at the things that can be implemented regardless of the structure of your story. And I'll be laying out my references in the order of the novels' releases if I use multiple novels for reference within a section. Now, with all of that said, let's get into it. Honestly, when writing the script for this, I thought that I would be starting like at the beginning, which seems to make sense, but then I realized that looking at the rest of the video through this lens might help increase the meaning of all the different sections, so I wanted to address it first, and that is rereadability. Imbuing your story with rereadability is something that I think could be worth putting your time into, because part of what I think makes MXTX's stories work as well as they do and be as memorable as they are is because there is definite worth in rereading them. There are things that you will only really catch on to upon a second reread, and it's not just one or two things, it is like almost mountains in my opinion, which, just a side note, is probably why the adaptations, when they're as accurate as MXTX's adaptations are also worth watching even though you've already read the novels, is because you catch on to things that you might not have caught on to during your first reading. I wanted to mention this specifically because I feel like it plays a big role in MXTX's storytelling, and we see it even at the very start of most of her stories. I caveat most because since I haven't read Scumvillain to the end, I can't give an accurate representation of it in Scumvillain's case. But for Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, we have Wei Wuxian sized up the youth. The boy was gentle in disposition, refined and elegant, noble in his bearing, with a light grin curving the corners of his lips. This was a good sprout, very worth of encouragement, and Wei Wuxian mentally gave him a nod of approval. The child had set up the flag formation in a proper and orderly manner, and his upbringing really was quite commendable as well. Wei Wuxian wondered who among the terrifying group full of uptight sticks in the mud, known as the Land Clan, had managed to raise such a good junior. Because the answer to this question is only revealed really far into the novel, to a point where you might even have forgotten this thought existing on a first read through, it only really pays off on a second read through. Similarly, in Heaven Official's Blessing, we have this. The lines were vulgar and crass, not worthy of being entrance couplets. The calligraphy was also so wild, clumsy, and frenzied, a disgrace to call it calligraphy at all. It was as if someone took a brush, while drunk, and scribbled with foul intent, and then the words were blown over by a blast of evil aura to form it. At face value, this small snippet seems unimportant, but on a second read-through it becomes clear that this could be a small clue and a hint towards the situation surrounding Ho Chang's tattoo. This next part is mainly going to be focusing on Scumvillain, because I believe that Scumvillain is a very good interpretation of Mark Twain's quote, "Write what you know," or in my understanding, write within your capabilities. Scumvillain to me is an excellent demonstration of an author being aware of potential pitfalls and weaknesses that could crop up in their writing and making contingency plans to avoid that. Obviously, this is just my own interpretation. There's no way to know if MXTX actually planned all of this, but I do feel that one of the hardest things for a writer to know is when you're ready and skilled enough to be able to write a certain thing. And Scumvillain to me was an excellent example of an author recognizing where their own shortcomings might be and planning around it, so to speak. The novel was a serialized work on JJWXC, otherwise known as the Xinjiang Literature City, which means that the novel was released chapter by chapter rather than as one whole novel from the get-go. This leaves the story open for potential and almost inevitable plot holes, as you might start exploring things at one stage within the story that you did not intentionally plan on exploring, and thus it comes up later without having necessarily been properly foreshadowed or set up and woven into the story earlier on. MXTX's solution to this: write a story that canonically has plot holes and in-story inconsistencies with in-story justifications, basically. MXTX's solution to this: write a story that canonically has plot holes and things that don't make sense. And because of the way that it is written, there's literal in-world justifications for all of it. Now, I do want to clarify that I don't think these kinds of solutions should be used to excuse lazy writing, but it's just an inevitable fact that editing and story overview is much more difficult in serialized fiction, and I think it was smart of her to try and compensate for that. Secondly, it's important to note that this was MXTX's first published novel. Now, how many novels she wrote before this, no one can say, but it is very possible that her understanding of world building, and especially world building within the cultivation fantasy angle, might not have been as crisp as it is at this point in her writing. So what could potentially be the solution here? Well, having it be a transmigration story that is basically told from the perspective of a modern day person finding himself in a fictional cultivation setting. This helps with the tone of the story as well as any potential inconsistencies that might crop up. Say the fact that there are horses and coaches as well as flying swords. This is something that MXTX herself calls out within the story, and personally I just kind of respect it. Now, am I saying that you have to just kind of like accept all your writing flaws and not work to improve them instead of working around them? No, but I do believe that having something similar to a trial and error in Scumvillain allowed MXTX to improve the way she approached her other books. In my opinion, compensating for your weaknesses until you're a good enough writer that they aren't weaknesses anymore is commendable. Okay, now we finally get into the beginning, and most beginnings have two options. One, straight up just start, and the other is a prologue. Unlike Heaven Official's Blessing and Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, Scumvillain actually starts just straight up as a normal chapter, and unlike with Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation and Heaven Official's Blessing, Scumvillain starts as a normal chapter, and importantly, it starts with exposition, which is something that is often seen as a taboo when starting a book, so I wanted to take a moment to look at that. Proud Immortal Demon Way is a male power fantasy of Estalia novel. To be more specific, Proud Immortal Demon Way was a monster-fighting, escapist cultivation novel with an incomparably ridiculous length, a golden finger that broke every rule, and a harem size nearing 3 digits, seeing as every single female character fell for the protagonist. The year's hottest Stellian novel, there was no other. Even though most would say that Scumvillain is MXTX's weakest novel, I still think it has a very strong start. The first sentence on its own, in my opinion, does some work in order to intrigue the audience, but the first 2 paragraphs is where I think it really shines. It creates multiple questions, world builds, and also technically defines some genres of the novel all in one fell swoop. If the reader has not read the blurb at the back of the book, these first 2 paragraphs might make them question, why is this book telling me about another book at the start, and also whether or not the tropes that are listed here might also appear in this novel, hence the creation of potential world building and questions. However, if you as the reader are aware of the fact that this is a Danmei novel, there is definite humor to be found in the description of a novel that is probably the exact opposite of what you're expecting this novel to be, which might in turn also create intrigue. The chapter then continues giving a short description of Proud Immortal Demon Way before we meet our protagonist, who has been transmigrated into the novel. What I find quite good about this first chapter is the fact that humor is used quite liberally in order to expand on Shen Qingqi's character, as well as informing us about quite a few grim details of the original novel, which clues you into the fact that this is not just going to be all fun and games. Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation and Heaven Official's Blessing, on the other hand, both start with prologues, which has a weird stigma against it, and along with that is the stigma of exposition, which both of these feature quite heavily. So how do they make it work? So the real question is, how do they make it work? The answer for me with Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation is actually it starts off with a very strong dialogue and then proceeds with creating as many questions within the reader's mind as possible. First, there's the opening line, which ironically actually works better if you've already read the blurb or you know who the main character is, but it's as follows. Rejoice, rejoice, Wei Wuxian is dead. This works in the sense that people who are going in blind will wonder, who is this and why should I care? While people who have read the blurb will potentially wonder, isn't that the main character? What's going on? It then jumps into explaining how he died, as well as mentioning a little about the clans that played important roles in his death. But what I find interesting in this is that it features another concept that's quite important to beginnings, and that is called story in miniature. Basically, the idea behind this is that your first line or first scene should give you a sense of being a miniaturized version of what the story and the themes are gonna be within the rest of the novel. And Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation is, to me, the first example of this happening, because it tells you and shows you that the story changes depending on who's telling it, which makes you wonder how much of what we as the audience are being told about this person can be trusted. And to highlight all of that, the final passage within the first chapter is as follows. No one could be worshipped on the divine altar forever. Legends were only legends. It's an interesting place to end it on, because I feel as if it invokes this question of where does Wei Wuxian truly lie within the spectrum of everyone's discussions, as well as hinting to the fact that everything might not be as dead and buried as everyone has been led up to believe until now, without actually confirming it. There's a lot of world building to be found in this prologue, as well as the fact that this is the only chapter within the entire story that's not from Wei Wuxian's perspective. And for all of these reasons, I feel that it is definitely worth having this prologue here. That sounds very ominous, but basically I don't have any particular opinion on prologues either way. I do think that every single scene and chapter within a story needs to be earned, and I think that this prologue definitely earns its place. In comparison, I think Heaven Official's Blessing uses contrast in the exposition in order to pull the readers in and make the exposition more palatable. The opening line is as follows. Among all the deities of the heaven, there was one famous laughingstock of the three realms. I believe this works to pull the reader in because the idea of there being a specific laughingstock of the heavens is so juxtaposed with the entire essence of being a deity that the very proposition of it even existing is bound to cause some intrigue. This juxtaposition is then further highlighted when we find out that the laughingstock that they're talking about used to be a prince. It creates a very pointed and purposeful theme of dissonance that crops up throughout the rest of the story, which I think again adds to the rereadability of the novel. The prologue then delves into the prince's history, throwing in many important moments and details that only become really obvious later on in the novel. It's wonderful for two reasons. Firstly, it sets up important events of the story that we might not even realize as being important at that point because it's in the past. How could it potentially affect the present or the future? But secondly, through the telling of these events, we get a very good feel for the tone of the novel. It blends the seriousness of the situations that are mentioned with the humor of the character voice in a way that will carry us through the rest of the story. This blend is present within all three of MXTX's works, but I feel that it really shines here in terms of being present immediately and giving us a good idea of what the rest of the novel is going to feel like. Okay, now we are on to the next section, and that is the mixing of genres. Basically, to me, this just means that there's more than one genre within a novel that carries equal weight. So it's not a fantasy with a little bit of romance. It means that you can't remove any of the genres without stripping away a crucial part of the story. And though I find that fantasy romance is one of the more common genre mixes, I do feel that MXTX's is more a blend of horror, supernatural, fantasy, and romance, but that is just me being very particular. Now, what I find works with MXTX's novels in particular is the fact that she introduces at least 2 or 3 of the main genres as soon as possible, with perhaps the exception of the romance, ironically, but I think that many people who pick up her novels pick it up for the Danmei tag specifically, and thus it's not as necessary to immediately highlight it. For me, the lesson here is to be very aware of why your readership will probably end up picking your book and introducing elements that might put them off as soon as possible. The reason for this is that you obviously don't want to be wasting the time of readers when your story's flavor might be the complete opposite of what they're looking for. To give you guys some quote-unquote statistics, in Scumvillain, the fantasy, anti-hero, and potential romance elements are all introduced on the first page, technically page 9 of the official English translation of volume 1, while the idea of transmigration is introduced on page 6/15, and the horror elements are introduced on page 10/19. In Grandmaster, the fantasy element is introduced on page 1/9, the horror is introduced on page 2/10, and the idea of reincarnation is technically introduced on page 1, considering this chapter title, but in text, its first introduction is on page 4/12. Finally, in Heaven Official's Blessing, the fantasy aspect is introduced on the first page, page 11. The horror is on page 4/14, and technically, the first introduction of the love interest is on page 3/13, though we don't know it at this point, so I don't feel I can count the romance as being officially introduced in terms of genre. So basically all I'm saying is that if you know your romance novel, for example, is going to have a lot of frat boy humor that might put some people off, or there's going to be multiple murders, include these elements as early as possible. Indicate your tone of the novel as early as possible, because that'll ensure that the people who want to be there for the ride stick around, and it'll save a lot of time for the people who aren't interested. Okay, on to the next section, we have tropes. Now, tropes to me come down to 3 things. 1, get your audience to care. 2, know the world of your story. And 3, know your audience. To me, tropes aren't a bad thing. Most fictional stories rely on tropes in one way, shape, or form. But what really differentiates a good trope from a bad trope is the way that they are handled and written. MXTX, for example, makes sure that you care about the characters before the tropes really start to happen, and then by the time that you see a trope coming from a mile away, you're almost anticipating it, wanting to see how this character that you've grown to love is going to handle it. And also because of the way that MXTX crafts her characters, even though you think you might be familiar with a trope, oftentimes she ends up subverting your expectations, but in such a way that it makes so much sense for who this character is and the personality that you have come to know from them. And this to me is where knowing the rules of your world that you have created as well as your audience comes in, because technically anything can happen in a novel, but knowing what your audience enjoys and what are the limitations within the world that you've created, and that world includes the characters and what they will and won't do, makes it a lot easier to discard the tropes that will weaken your story and keep the tropes that will make your audience happy and make your story stronger. A good example of MXTX knowing her audience, or potentially drawing this audience because of what she herself loves, is the fact that MXTX's novels are very love triangle averse, shall I say. You read it because you know that the two people, the two main characters, are very much meant for each other, and there is very rarely a case that I have found where they're shipped outside of the two themselves. And much like how in a traditional romance you know that there has to be a happy ending, if your audience loves your stories for the tropes that you gravitate towards, it will be a comfort to them. It's something that they can feel assured in. So getting readers to come back for another story because they trust you with the tropes that they love can also be a benefit. Okay, now that we're done with some of the more introductory concepts, I do want to take a moment to get back into the structural things, starting with a scene. So for this, I am going to be looking at the final scene within each of the first volumes of the different novels. And the reason for this is not only because all of them are basically the end of the arc, so they should be more or less similar in terms of their structural purpose, and also this is far enough into each of the novels that MXTX at this point should be in a comfortable flow with her writing, so we get a better sense of what her typical writing is like versus at the start or end of a novel when you're really trying your best to shine. I do also want to point out that even though all of these are going to be technically the end of volumes, I don't think they were originally intended to be the end of anything, so that's why I feel more comfortable using them as references for seeing what MXTX is like when she's found her stride. Okay, so the first scene that we're going to be looking at is from page 288 to 291 of Scumvillain Self-Saving System Volume 1. So as a quick sum up, this scene is very much a transitional scene where a journey is coming to an end, there's some pleasantries that are exchanged, and future plot points are potentially being set up. The scene follows directly after a plot and suspense heavy scene, so the fact that the scene is a little bit more chill, I guess you could say, does help to balance it, and also in my opinion allows the audience a little bit of breathing and recovery room after the stress from the previous scene. But it could potentially also be a little bit of a letdown as you go from a very compelling scene to one that's at face value not that compelling. What I think does make this work is that MXTX used the previous scene as a very plot heavy scene, and she decides to juxtapose this with a scene that is actually very emotional, and that helps to elevate a scene that could otherwise have been quite plain. But not only did it balance the plot and emotional aspects, where the previous scene was very much more focused on the action and fantasy side of the story, this scene brings it back to the more relationship-based side of it with the two main characters, so that the needs of the ideal reader is met in both regards, because both genres are being addressed in relatively quick succession. And in my opinion, as far as endings goes, this is quite a strong one, especially if it wasn't originally intended to be an ending of a volume, because it not only gives us an idea of what's to come, but it also hints at the idea that it's not going to be smooth sailing like the protagonist might expect. There was 5 years before Lobingher would leave the endless abyss and return to the human realm. If nothing went wrong, the mushrooms they had harvested would definitely be enough to save Shenjing Chia's life. However, he had forgotten the fundamental stupidity of proud immortal Demon Way. If nothing went wrong, at such a crucial juncture in the novel's storytelling, that meant it wasn't exciting enough. These last lines nod to the fantasy, romance, humor, and tension all in one go, which in my opinion makes for a pretty strong closing. Okay, then moving on to Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, the scene that I'm going to be looking at is page 286 to 350. As you will note from the amount of pages that this scene takes up, the scene is quite a long one, and I do feel that MXTX's scenes grow longer between Scumvillain and Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, so I want to take a moment to see how she manages to hold the audience attention for as long as she does. So the scene has a lot of push and pull between relationship moments and plot relevant moments. So it starts off focused on the relationship and has quite a few important moments before going over to the plot in an almost exposition form, and then moving back to another relationship important moment in the form of "How did you recognize me?" Wei Wuxian asked. "Think for yourself," Lang Wangji replied. The next section of the scene almost seems to combine the two elements, as it's genuinely a plot-heavy and exposition-heavy scene, but the characters involved in this plot and exposition are, to me, clear parallels of Wei Wuxian and Lang Wangji, and so in that way it almost feels as if their relationship is still a focal point of the part of the scene, even though it's not technically present. Sanlang pursued the lingering traces of his good friend of time has passed. At first, one still heard talk of where he had gone. However, as time passed, there were no more words to be heard. The next part of the scene focuses back on Wei Wuxian and Lang Wangji and reintroduces the mystery of the whipped scars on Lang Wangji's back. It then briefly focuses back on the previous plot point before introducing a new and continuing mystery. Truth be told, there are many more things that happen in this one singular scene that I kind of can't believe is one scene because of how well it flows and the fact that it changes locations multiple times, and yet it genuinely is still just one scene. But I hope these small snippets and descriptions helped to show how many peaks and valleys there are throughout the scene to help ensure that the audience's attention is retained. The final scene that we're going to be examining for this section is from Heaven Official's Blessing, page 355 to 372 of the Official English Translation, Volume 1. This is an incredibly important scene, as it's not only the reveal of one of the characters' identities, even though technically the audience has probably clued onto it long ago, but it also is such an important scene as it's one of the few openly romantic scenes within the first arc of the novel. There's a balance of the romantic side of it, the flirting, with a lot of very important big picture moments that are hinted at, and I just think it's done so well and so smoothly. And even though personally I would be very happy to just watch them flirt and be domestic together for pages and pages on end, MXTX gives us that while also giving us the final threads of a previous plotline, and even going as far as to use that previous plotline to highlight potential connections between Ho Chang and Shilian. So just overall love it. Only there was another here with the surname Hua, so that might cause some confusion. But then he thought Hua Xie was a fake name he had took from the first word of the title Flower Crown Martial God, so Hua Chang may very well be a fake name too. That they both coincidentally picked the same word flower for the surname was rather interesting. So the next part of the scene then focuses back on the hidden identity aspect, and even though now the mystery of San Lang versus Ho Chang has been solved, a new mystery is introduced in the form of Ho Chang's true form, which in my opinion does well to keep the audience intrigued. The scene ends off with many big important things being mentioned, but also there are so many moments here that hit right in the heart during a read-through, but that initially raise a lot of interesting questions upon your first reading experience. And what I really like here is the use of something that MXTX uses often, and I struggle to put a name to it, but it's basically you think something's important and then realize that it's even more important than it was originally framed to be, and that is in the form of a ring that Shilian is given. From a normal human understanding, a ring is quite significant, and you later find out that it's even more significant than we were originally led to believe. So that is something that she does quite often, and this was a very good example of that for me that I just wanted to point out quickly. No one bothered to question why after coming clean about their identities, a god and a ghost could still lie together on a crappy mat, laughing and chatting. I feel all of these elements are very important in driving the scene forward, but what I think ties all of it together so well is the way that each of the characters' personalities manage to shine through in every action. The example I just gave might seem plain, but I feel that it points to how, despite their stations in life and the complicated situations surrounding them, they find peace and happiness with each other, and it really, to me, grounds the rest of the story that is quite fantastical in a very human need and emotion. Okay, so we are on to day 2 of filming, and I can very much tell that this is not the kind of video I'm used to making, because it took me about 2 hours and 40 minutes to film the first section of this video and about 8 hours to edit the first 20 minutes of it. So this is probably going to take me a little bit longer than I anticipated, so if you notice me changing clothes ever so often, it's because it's different days and this is taking me a little while. So anyway, let's focus on the next section, which is the scene openings specifically. For both the scene openings and the scene endings that we'll be getting to a little bit later on, I'm going to be referring to the first scene in each of the different novels as second volumes. Scumbag Villain Self-Saving System Volume 2 starts as follows. 3 years went by in the blink of an eye. During these 3 years, other than occasionally asking Liu Qingge for assistance in clearing his meridians or treating his poison, requesting medicinal prescriptions from Mu Qingfeng, and briefly visiting Qingjing Peak to arrange leveling missions for his disciples, Shen Qingque spent most of his time wandering about the outside world. I believe that this intro paragraph is effective in establishing multiple things in one go. Firstly, we have the acknowledgement of time frame, saying that it's 3 years after the events of the end of volume 1, which should already pique concerns considering the fact that at the end of volume 1 we were told that Luo Binghe was only expected to return in 5 years' time, so why exactly are we checking back in with Shen Qingque ahead of schedule, basically? The next thing is that it allows for a little bit of exposition about what happened in the time since we last checked in with Shen Qingque. And lastly, and in my opinion potentially most importantly, to me it showcases that Shen Qingque is almost viewing his life as mundane since Luo Binghe is no longer in it. Words like wandering in the text seem to showcase a lack of purpose and aim, and even perhaps a level of detachment. Though this is not my favorite opening line considering how many other opening lines there are to choose from, I do think that it does a surprising amount in conveying exposition in a very short amount of time. Then moving on to Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, we have these opening lines. The Shudong region was inundated with river valleys and surrounded by tall mountains. With such rugged terrain, breaking up the flow of winds, much of it was shrouded in year-round mist. Wei Wuxian and Lang Wangji traveled in the direction that the ghost left arm had pointed, finally happening upon a tiny village. This intro to the second volume of Grandmaster is quite atmospheric and plot relevant, and it also does a quick job of establishing where we left off since the end of volume 1. Even though it is short and again not one of my favorites, I do feel that the fact that it's so atmospheric and so few words adds quite a few points for me. And then finally we have Heaven Official's Blessing Volume 2 opening. Shi Lian knew the ring must have been left behind by Huo Chang. He held it in his hand, wondering for a moment, what could this be? This personally has to be my favorite line opening of the 3 that we just examined, because it does a quick job of reminding us of where we left off, it introduces a mystery, and it highlights the romantic aspects all in one go. So I wanted to check a few boxes when selecting the lines that we just looked at. Firstly, I wanted them to be around the same time within each of the stories, and also I didn't want to pick the absolute best first lines because I wanted to look at a typical first line, something that you might not have put too much effort into, but that you should still have some consideration for. Of course, if there's a very important moment that is going to be happening within a scene, you're more likely to pay attention to how a scene starts. But I wanted to showcase what MXTX pulls off when she might not even be putting that much thought into how the scene is going to be starting. So obviously, as you can see, all of these scenes are quite different, but what I do hope all of them still showcase is that if you can, use your opening lines to convey more than one thing, because in that way there's a much higher likelihood of you intriguing your audience, because the one thing that you put stock into might not be the thing that your audience puts stock into. But if you give them multiple things, it's more likely that at least one of the elements will be something that intrigues them. Okay, so now moving on to the scene endings for each of the above scenes. With Scumberland, it ends as follows. Lobing her further opened the wound on his hand. Hot blood flowed endlessly from it, yet he seemed even happier. Shazun, don't spit it out. Even though a heavenly demon's blood is dirty, you won't necessarily die from drinking it, right? He wouldn't die, but he would live a fate worse than death. Okay, so this is quite a cliffhanger to end it on, not only because there's the actual cliffhanger of what Lobing her is going to be doing to Shen Qingque, but there's also the emotional cliffhanger because this is the first time that Lobing her has shown actual aggression towards Shen Qingque. It's grim, but it's deeply intriguing in my opinion. Next, we have the scene ending for Grandmaster, which goes as follows. For some reason, he suddenly very much wanted to see Lang Wangji's face. Qianbei, Mo Qianbei. Wei Wuxian snapped out of it. Lan Shizui said in a hushed tone, "The door to that old lady's room has opened." This is quite an interesting place to end it because on the one hand you have the very typical cliffhanger for the scene ending, but what I also find interesting is that the top of the quote clearly demonstrates that Wei Wuxian is more focused on Lang Wangji in this moment than he is the actual plot. Obviously, this is kind of an aside to the scene ending itself, but I did want to point it out real quick while we were here. And that is the fact that MXTX takes opportunities like these where the focus is very much on the plot to also seed in small notes that Wei Wuxian is interested in Lang Wangji, as well as the not so hidden feelings coming from Lang Wangji's side as well, which really allows it to integrate very smoothly into the plot itself. And then again we have Heaven Official's Blessings scene ending. Speaking of which, don't we need to go undercover for this mission to Ghost City? Question mark, question mark, question mark? Shilian replied. This sets up knowledge for what the next arc of the story is going to be, as well as creating hope that our two main characters might reunite. So even though it's very short and much less dramatic than the other two, I do still think that it acts as a effective cliffhanger, so to speak. Out of the three examples that I just showed, I do think that Scumberland has the most effective scene ending, but just like with the scene openings of all of these, the scene endings here serve multiple purposes as well as introducing multiple plot threads, which I think makes them very strong. What I think is more notable with the scene endings versus the scene openings though is that with the scene endings, all of them introduce intrigue on both the plot and the emotional level, and I don't think this means that you have to be writing a romance for this to work. But I do think that if you have emotional ties with different characters within your story and you can somehow bring them or an emotional aspect of them into the intrigue at the end of a scene, that might be a very good idea. The next section that I want to be looking at is conflict creation within the different stories. So what I love and hate in equal measure with MXTX's conflict creation is the fact that she's so good at tailoring her conflicts to hurting the characters involved in said conflict as much as possible. Again, because I have yet to finish Scumvillain, I only have a very short and small example from Scumvillain to give you guys that happens within the first volume of the novel. With Scumvillain, we have Shen Jingqie, who greatly admires the protagonist from the original novel called Luo Binghe. And to make matters worse, Shen Jingqie is well aware that he is doomed to die at the hands of Luo Binghe, and to make matters worse, he is unable to change the course of events that will lead to Luo Binghe hating him. Not only that, he is tasked with throwing Luo Binghe into the endless abyss, which destroys Luo Binghe's trust in him and seals his fate with his own hands. All of which, in my opinion, is extremely tragic. Similarly, in Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, the conflicts that Wei Wuxian faces is conflicts that is the worst for him specifically. We have Wei Wuxian giving up his golden core to help Zhang Cheng, which in turn slightly alienates Wei Wuxian from the other cultivation clans. Then we have Wei Wuxian choosing to help the Wen clan, which causes further distrust in the rest of the cultivation world. And finally, we have Wei Wuxian accidentally murdering his sister's husband, which leads to him becoming public enemy number 1. Finally, in Heaven Official's Blessing, we have Shi Lian, who after his first ascension makes it his mission to save everyone. But that decision causes friction and leads to the destruction of not only his family, but all of the people that he wanted to help in the first place. He then ascends a second time, only to wreak havoc in the heavens and be punished with descension again, as well as having his spiritual powers restricted. These are just a few examples of the conflict creation within the stories, and to me a very important aspect of this is the fact that all of these conflicts are, even if accidentally, created by the protagonists themselves. They drive the story, they drive the conflict. But what makes this even better or worse, depending on your viewpoints, is the fact that none of these conflicts feel avoidable. The situations at hand clash with the characters' personalities in such a way that it isn't feasible for it to play out in any other way than it does end up playing out, which in my opinion makes the conflict feel more valid and earned. Okay, so we are on to day 3 of filming, and the next section that we are going to be looking at is story atmosphere, which is where I feel like we're finally going to be able to look a little bit at the physical writing within the story, like actual examples of beautifully written moments in the story, in my opinion. So firstly, I kind of wanted to do honorable mentions of atmosphere within Scumvillain and Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation before we focus in on one very specific scene within Heaven Official's Blessing. So firstly, with Scumvillain, we have Shen Jingqie pulled Mu Qingfang over to sit down and glanced at the glittering water by the boat. He could even see several fish happily swishing their tails as they swam by. "This water is so clear," he said idly. Right after he said this, something much larger drifted after the swimming fish. Face down in the water was a corpse. The atmosphere here starts off relatively calm, but knowing where we are in the book, most readers will probably be primed to be weary. Then the start of the second paragraph uses uncertain language to put the reader on edge before the reveal in the final sentence. Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation's example is with the introduction of the cloud recesses. Within the garden of waterside pavilions, charmingly dispersed, there were long, endless stretches of black-roofed white walls, shrouded in the mountainous mists year-round. To stand within them was akin to standing amidst a transcendent sea of clouds. Fog permeated the early morning, the first rays obscured in haze, complementing its name, the cloud recesses. To me, this paragraph creates a feeling of tranquility and coolness. The word choice to me emphasizes the vastness and peace that the clan lives in year-round. Words like mountainous mist telling you about the location as well as the weather of the area. Furthermore, gardens of waterside pavilions, black roofed and white walled, all give you scenic information as well as a color palette to work with in your mind when creating images. Muted blues and greens, very nature-based, as well as the idea of yin and yang, all of which to me is accentuated with sentences like amidst a transcendent sea of clouds. And it even seems to hint that not even the strength of the sun can disturb the peace and tranquility of the area. Whereas in the example for Scum Villain, we have contrast and setting from one moment to the next, creating the atmosphere. Grandmaster's example relies on the color and word choice to really emphasize the feeling. Now moving on to Heaven Official's Blessing, I want to take a moment to look at atmosphere on a bit of a larger scale, using the first meeting between Shilian and Ho Chang as an example. Thus, Shilian leaned back in a proper sitting position and closed his eyes to rest his mind. Unexpectedly, not long after, a child's laughter abruptly sounded by his ear. Hee hee, ha ha, ki ki, chi chi. The laughter rippled across the mountain, ethereal and peculiar. However, the bridal sedan neither paused nor stopped, continuing steadily on its way. Not even Nanfang or Fu Yao made a noise, seeming to not have noticed anything amiss. Shilian opened his eyes and called in a low voice, Nanfang, Fu Yao. From the left side of the bridal sedan, Fu Yao answered, What is it? Something's come, Shilian replied. By that time, this wedding procession had gradually entered the deeper parts of Mount Yujin. Quiet blanketed the wilderness, and the creaking of the wooden sedan, the crackling of broken leaves and branches when stepped on, the breathing of the sedan carriers, all seemed to sound louder in the silence. The section does well to create an eerie atmosphere. It uses sound in multiple places, the creaking of the wooden sedan, the crackling of the broken leaves, and the breathing of the sedan carriers. But strangely enough, looking at this scene, I realized that what surrounds the sound and the description of the sound is what makes it eerie, in my opinion. Because if you were to set this at a lantern festival, this might lead to the feeling of a hustling and bustling, busy place where everyone is too close together and you're almost having people encroach on your space, which is quite different from what we get here, obviously. And this is where I think the acknowledgement of the lack of sound obviously really plays into it. With a sentence like quiet blanketed the wilderness, we get the sense that the wilderness that is usually full of life and sound has somehow been captured and restrained by the blankets of silence, so that the sounds that we do hear are more intense. We also have the line of laughter rippled across the mountain, which to me almost suggests that the laughter was so jarring that it had a physical impact on the unwilling listeners. In contrast, later on in the scene, MXTX transform this eerie atmosphere into something quiet, mysterious, but not threatening. All of a sudden, everything fell quiet. The sound of wind, the sound of the sea of trees, the howling and roaring of demonic creatures, all sank into a deadly silence in an instant, as if they were afraid of something. And then he heard a very soft chuckle. It sounded like a man, but also a youth. Julien sat poised and quiet. The silk band oreille was quietly encircling his hand, ready to strike at a moment's notice. If whoever had come showed a trace of killing aura, it would instantly, wildly strike back with 10 times the power. Yet, unexpectedly, what came wasn't the anticipated attack, or any murderous intent, but something else. The curtain of the bridal sedan was lightly lifted, and from underneath the bright red veil, Julien saw the person had extended a hand to him. The fingers were well defined, A red string was tied on the third finger, and on that long, slender, fair hand, it looked like a bright and colorful affinity knot. To establish this change in atmosphere, we have explicit mention of all the eerie sounds, wind, howling, and roaring falling away. Then we have the description of a soft chuckle. It's not creeping, it's not lurking, it's just soft. And here, in my opinion, is where the point of view can also create atmosphere. Now, in some senses, this is quite obvious, but here especially, we rely on the fact that Chilean himself is not intimidated. All the things that Chilean takes note of steers away from an ominous feeling. Wasn't the anticipated attack, for example, a long, slender, fair hand, and the focus on the infinity knot, all of it to me seems to indicate that Chilean isn't feeling threatened by this person, so why, as the readers, should we? And to take it a step further, in contrast, the actions and descriptions all seem to lean more towards gentleness, if anything. Before we move on, there's one other thing that I want to mention, and that is color. The color red is quite prominently featured in this novel, and even though it is a relatively prominent color in both Scumvillain and Grandmaster as well, I feel like it takes special precedence in this novel in particular. And the reason why I wanted to point it out specifically is because I feel that the use of color to contribute to the imagery and atmosphere of the scene is often undervalued. Red could easily become a threatening color, in my opinion, the color of blood splattering on the ground. But instead, in this novel, MXTX reframes it into a bright red, a joyful color that is associated with the red string of fate, love, and beauty. To me, the fact that she put the thought into reframing it in such a way makes the shift in atmosphere clearer, makes the scene as a whole feel more vivid, and just highlights the romance, in my opinion. But okay, that part's really just me. Anyway, but with all of that said, I think we can move on to the next section, which is characters. So with regards to the character, I feel that many of the main characters within MXTX's stories have juxtapositions between their personalities as well as parts of their past and pivotal plot points. And then with the side characters, they have their own arcs that get quite fully explored as well. These two factors put together is what I believe makes so many of MXTX's characters so compelling and so memorable. It also leads to making the story so much more compelling and gut-wrenching, because you're not only understanding the events that are unfolding within the novel from the main character's perspective, but also from the perspectives of so many other people, which leads to so much more deeper investment and sympathy on many sides. This means that even if you don't agree with the actions of a certain character, there's a much deeper understanding for where that character is coming from and why characters are making the decisions that they are making than you would get in many other novels. Now, to be fair, I am aware that MXTX's novels, at least when they're translated into English, are quite a bit longer than the average Western novel is. Scumvillain clocks in at around 420,000, Grandmaster clocks in at 470,000, and Heaven Official's Blessing at around 780,000 words, in comparison to the average Western novel, which is between 50,000 to 150,000. But I did still want to give some examples that could hopefully potentially be implemented regardless of the length of your novel. Now, I do want to acknowledge that it's obviously very clear that MXTX has two archetypes she prefers in her main characters. One is the seemingly aloof, slightly distant person on the side of good, paired with a chaotic, might or might not be evil character. But there are then very different ways in which this is explored, but there are then different ways in which she explores this archetype, which is something that I think is worth looking into. So even if you're not focusing specifically on these archetypes within your own writing, I think trying to see how different types of personalities, aka archetypes, can be explored is very much worth it. And in her case, I think she uses a juxtaposition in two distinct ways to do this. First, there's the audience expectations versus the reality with the goal of creating intrigue. Starting with the scum villain, we have Shen Qingqie and Luo Binghe. With Shen Qingqie, there's the original character before our protagonist steps into the mix, who is already kind of a juxtaposition and a contradiction in and of himself. In other people's eyes, the original character is seen to be this proud, well-respected and well-known cultivator, but in reality he is rude, cowardly and cruel, so he's only putting up a front to save face. But this is then further switched up because once Shen Yun inhabits Shen Qingqie's body, he has that outward appearance and is kind of forced to follow along with the script for a decent part of the story, which then means that we get the inner monologue being humorously contrasted because he's so horrified by all the things that he has to do, and he's kind of profusely apologizing in his head about it. So it just creates another juxtaposition, in my opinion. And then with Luo Binghe, at least at the start of the novel, we are told that he is this cruel and vicious demon king, and yet when we first meet him, he is the complete opposite. He's demure, pipey-like, and just really wants to be liked by his Shizun, aka Shen Qingqie. Then the second part of the juxtaposition comes in with the characters' expectations versus their reality, and the goal of it kind of being humor or tragedy, respectively. With regards to humor, we have examples such as people expecting Shen Qingqie to be this high and mighty, very aloof figure, and yet oftentimes he comes across as quite silly, or he does something very kind and thoughtful, which surprises the other characters and actually causes them to change the way that they approach him, which then in turn has an impact on the plot because what they were expecting from him is not what they ended up getting. With regards to the expectation versus reality within the characters being played for tragedy, an example is perhaps the way that Luo Binghe is often perceived to be a meek person, and as such a lot of people don't treat him well, or they think they know what's best for him and act accordingly, and that often leads to him being hurt either physically or emotionally in many circumstances. This is again seen in both Grandmaster and Heaven Official's blessing. With Wei Wuxian, for example, we are told that he is this much feared demonic cultivator, and yet our first encounter with him is a chaotic, light-hearted, and very humorous situation despite the dire circumstances. He seems carefree and like a bit of a goofball. Similarly, Lang Wangji is presented as stiff, unyielding, and rule-abiding. And yet, even at the start, there are small hints that let you know that this might just be Wei Wuxian's bias and that he could potentially not be seeing things clearly. Moving on to how the other characters perceive them, this is where to me it gets even more interesting because despite people viewing Wei Wuxian as lazy and uncaring, it's made very clear by the text that he's actually quite intelligent and that potentially he is acting out because of the way that the people around him are unintentionally holding him back. Another way that he is then later perceived in life is obviously as this very cruel demonic cultivator, and even though a lot of the times it is kind of played for laughs, it is really tragic at the same time because it leads to the alienation of the cultivation world and the death of a lot of people around Wei Wuxian. Similarly, Wei Wuxian's misunderstanding of Lang Wangji's character is played for both humor and laughs throughout the story as the audience becomes more and more aware of Lang Wangji's true feelings towards Wei Wuxian, while Wei Wuxian remains oblivious. Lastly, we have Shilian and Huo Cheng. Shilian is juxtaposed in both his station in life and his personality. He's introduced to us as a prince who had a fall from grace, but contrary to expectation, he ends up being a very down-to-earth, practical and silly person who likes collecting scraps. On the other hand, we are told that he is something of a failure, but then it becomes very clear that he is smart, resourceful, and that the people around him who decide to get close to him respect him a lot and choose to stay loyal to him, which I think speaks to his character. A third contradiction in his character is that, for the most part, he seems to be the sunny, carefree person, and yet it's revealed that there's a lot of heartache and darkness sometimes dwelling within his mind. Similarly, yet in direct contrast, we have Ho Chang, who is viewed as this terrifying demon king, and yet Shilian observes him to be kind and caring, even if his actions are slightly bewildering to him at the start. Something that I find interesting with regards to Ho Chang that I didn't really know where else to put it is the use of transparent mystery with regards to his character. From the get-go almost, it's very clear that Sang Lang and Ho Chang are one and the same. The text does very little to hide it, and yet a lot of his connections and motivations with regards to Shilian remains to be discovered throughout the novel, and thus his motivations to me are at once transparent and mysterious, which I think adds a lot to his character. The many small personality traits that make up these characters to me is what I think makes these characters work so well and feel so real, and it's something that I don't find explored that often with multiple characters within one novel. In my own writing, I often find that I don't know my characters well enough to be able to really explain why they're doing all the things that they're doing, or to know exactly what all their motivations would be at any given moment. And yet, many of these characteristics that seem to juxtapose each other so much and could feel very disconnected and illogical makes sense within MXTX's writing, because she understands how each of these different personality traits and motivations connect and work together to inform the person's actions. Okay, so the next section is going to be character relationships, and I'm going to be looking at mostly the main relationships, but also slightly at the side relationships. And I do want to mention that I'm only going to be focusing on Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation and Heaven Official's Blessing during this one, because as I said many times, I haven't finished Scumvillain, and I do feel that having the full context of the novel is important when analyzing their relationships. So for that reason, I don't feel comfortable doing that for Scumvillain yet. But if you have finished Scumvillain and you do think these apply to Scumvillain as well, feel free to leave that in the comments. Just mark it as a spoiler warning if you do, please, because as I said, haven't finished it and would like to be surprised. Anyway, with that disclaimer out of the way, focusing in on the main romance in MXTX's writing, I thought the section would be a lot longer than it actually ended up being, because even though both relationships feel so complex, they aren't that different once you start unpacking it, in my opinion. So the first thing to me when it comes to the main couples in MXTX's writing is that with regards to moral point of view, I feel that both characters are always on the same page. We see that in the way that Shilian and Ho Chang both approach problem solving, and we see it in the way that Wei Wuxian and Lang Wenji can put aside their misunderstanding of each other in order to help the people of the Wen clan. Second, and something that I feel should be obvious but that I feel the need to say nonetheless, is that the two people in the main relationships in MXTX's novels respect each other deeply. And I'm gonna say something very cliche right now, but it's because of that respect, in my opinion, that both of the characters in the two relationships are able to kind of like complete each other like puzzle pieces as we move through the rest of the novel. For example, Lang Wenji doesn't drink. Wei Wuxian is willing to drink for him in moments where him refusing to drink would have gotten him into trouble, and yet Wei Wuxian respects him enough to not force him to drink. Similarly, when Wei Wuxian is scared of dogs, Lang Wangji simply protects him and takes care of him in those scenarios. He doesn't belittle it or try and make it seem like it is not a valid fear. Now, of course, these examples might seem small, but to me, it's these small moments that build up to the bigger moments. It makes the bigger moments feel more genuine and true because you've already built up the groundwork. Instead of them scorning the small things about each other, they accept and support each other wherever necessary. Similarly, Ho Chang has good luck, which balances out Shilian's bad luck, and Shilian is completely unafraid of Ho Chang despite Ho Chang being the most feared ghost in their realm. But the third thing in the main relationship dynamics, and to me the thing that really anchors the relationship in MXTX's main couples, is the fact that they fulfill each other's deepest need. Starting with the love interests, Lang Wangji supports Wei Wuxian unconditionally, while Ho Chang understands and appreciates Shilian with all his flaws. On the other hand, Wei Wuxian offers Lang Wangji the unrestrained love that he was never allowed within his clan, and Shilian gave Ho Chang a purpose, told him that he mattered and that life was worth living. Of course, all the events surrounding this is much less straightforward, but at the core of it, I think this is what makes these romances so enchanting and magical. It's this feeling that these two characters just make sense together on every single level. Now, I want to take a very quick dive into quote-unquote side relationships. What I mean by this is not necessarily that it is side character relationships between each other, though those can fall under it as well, but it's more relationships that are not really focused on that much, but are still very important to the dynamics within the story. And because this is kind of a term that I've come up with while writing this essay, I do want to specify that I think side relationships can turn into like important relationships, but that's not generally where they start. But what I think ties all of these side relationships together is at least one fundamental understanding of the other person. And we see a very early example of this in Scum Villain between Shen Qingque and Liu Qingge. The relationship starts out with mutual hatred because of their clashing personalities and morals. And then the connection point to me happens because of a mutual understanding that the one owes the other because of an unexpected act. I would say after this, it progresses slowly into something that is beyond just a side relationship, but that to me is a very quick example of what I think a side relationship could be. With many of the side relationships, it seems to stem from a fundamental understanding of the other person. We see this in the past with Lang Wangji and Jiang Chang coming together through their mutual understanding of wanting to take out the Wens and look for Wei Wuxian. And in Heaven Official's Blessing, we see it with Nanfang and Fu Yao coming together with their agenda to accompany Shilian despite their dislike for each other, and also in a sense with Shilian and Ling Wen, who very clearly view each other almost as colleagues within the heavenly realm. The fact that MXTX is very clear in her mind about how all the characters view each other and the kind of dynamics that they have, I think help to carry the story and make it really feel as if these characters have their own world and relationships outside of what we're just simply seeing within the needs of the plot. Okay, so on to day 4, and we're going to be focusing first on symbolism. Just a quick note, I'm not going to be covering all the symbolism in all the different books because I feel like that in and of itself is enough to make a 2-hour video out of. So instead, I'm just going to be attempting to explain as many of the symbolic things as I can to demonstrate how MXTX uses symbolism to not only indicate a person's personality or their mindset during different points of the novels, but also her personal messages throughout the story. And I do just want to acknowledge that some of the symbolism might very well be me just overanalyzing things, as I tend to do. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that. And again, Scumvillain will unfortunately be excluded, as I don't want to form half-baked theories around it. With regards to Grandmaster, I feel the most obvious symbolism is the aspect of yin and yang. I think that many would agree that yin and yang is the most obvious symbolism within Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, not only because of the respective clothing of the two main characters, black and white, but also because of the impulsive and chaotic nature that is Wei Wuxian and the discipline and control that Lang Wangji embodies in return. Not only does the story, in my opinion, examine the positives and negatives of both approaches to life, but the ending very clearly to me states the viewpoint that you need a balance of both in order to be able to achieve happiness. The symbolism with the weapons is next, and to me, the symbolism with regards to both the instruments and the weapons was surprisingly dense, aka I was the one surprised and maybe just completely oblivious, especially with regards to Wei Wuxian's weapons and instruments. First is Wei Wuxian's sword Sui Bian, which he gets from the Zhang family, and it could be seen to be representative of the responsibilities and expectations placed on him by the cultivation world and the Zhang clan specifically, and it is then literally and metaphorically rendered useless after his descent into demonic cultivation. This is also highlighted when he no longer feels a need to carry his sword and is subsequently seen as useless and lesser than. Cheng Qing, on the other hand, is a small part of the real Wei Wuxian in my opinion. It symbolizes a person who is free to follow and explore his own ideas, but it is tainted with the pain and sacrifice that he had to go through in order to get it in the first place. Alternatively, the carelessly made temporary flute that Wei Wuxian uses after being resurrected is free of expectations and has no ties to his past, and not only that, it is later nurtured and refined by Lang Wangji in lieu of Cheng Qing, reflecting Wei Wuxian's own experience after being resurrected. What I also love, and this is a part that I feel I definitely could be reading too much into, but is the fact that Sui Bian and Cheng Qing are only really returned to him once he'd acknowledged the truths of the past, kind of come to accept himself and put the past behind him. Next, with regards to symbolism, is symbolism within locations, and to me, two places that carry a lot of symbolism is the Cloud Recesses and Lotus Pavilion. In my opinion, is the Cloud Recesses and Lotus Pier. The Cloud Recesses represent purity, discipline, and detachment, as well as tranquility and order. It's the entire foundation of how Lang Wangji was raised. Lotus Pier, on the other hand, is the ancestral home of the Zhang sect, and it represents family, loyalty, and tradition, all the foundations on which Wei Wuxian was raised. But the context of these locations make it clear that it comes with responsibility and expectations, and that they can't truly belong to either sect if they want to grow and be true to their own beliefs and morals. And so by the end of the novel, we have them visiting each of the sects while living outside of it. This to me symbolizes that it's okay to take the things that you learned while growing up and form your own opinions about it, and that it's okay to have your past still be a part of your life, even if you don't necessarily agree with all of the things that come attached to it. There's a balance to be had, basically. Even though there is much more symbolism that could be unpacked just with regards to Grandmaster, there is one specific aspect that I want to focus on before we move on to Heaven Official's Blessing, and that symbolism surrounds Lang Wangji specifically. Lang Wangji is, for all intents and purposes, technically the love interest to Wei Wuxian, and we never get his perspective during the events of the novel. So the symbolism surrounding him is one of the few ways in which we get insight into what is going on inside his mind. First is Lang Wangji's headband, which symbolizes restraint. It's at first accidentally removed by Wei Wuxian and then later willingly given up to Wei Wuxian by Lang Wangji. It's quite a literal representation of Lang Wangji's unwilling loss of control at the start versus his willing surrender of control to Wei Wuxian later on. The bunnies to me are also another form of symbolism, not only in symbolizing and showing Lang Wangji's caring nature, but also symbolizing his willingness to bend the rules for Wei Wuxian. We also have the sun-shot brand on Lang Wangji's chest, which I don't think only symbolizes Lang Wangji's need to share Wei Wuxian's pain with him, but also the fact that he wanted a permanent reminder of the impact that Wei Wuxian had on his life, proof of the mark that Wei Wuxian left on him emotionally. Lastly, there are the scars on Lang Wangji's back that to me symbolizes the burdens he's willing to bear for Wei Wuxian, the sacrifices he's willing to make, and the rules he's willing to break. I feel that all of the above symbolism subtly showcase all the conflicts going on in our characters' minds without having to bash a reader over the head with it. Now, moving on to Heaven Official's Blessing, the first small symbolic thing to me is peonies that we see as representative of Shilian. In Chinese culture, as far as I can tell, signify happiness, prosperity, and good luck. And I do think that that is a very good representative of Shilian with his kind and compassionate nature, even though I would argue that he does not have very good luck. But then again, what better luck is it than to have Ho Chang as your lifelong partner? So maybe it balances out. But speaking of our dear Crimson Rain Sword Flower, aka Ho Chang, he is a very big moments of symbolism in many ways for me. Ho Chang is obviously associated with the color red, which I think most would agree is associated with passion and love and dedication, which I think fits Ho Chang to a T. Also, some people feel that his name Crimson Rain Sword Flower is kind of an indication of a person looking for love and connection in a very dark space or time in their life, which I kind of like agree because it is very much part of his backstory in a way. But there is to me a lot more to his name than just that. With his name comes the symbolism of the red umbrella protecting a white flower, and I feel it's quite a literal symbolism of Ho Chang, the red umbrella, protecting Shilian, the white flower. And it's interesting to me that much like he chose the name for himself, it's also a position that he chose to take up willingly with regards to Shilian. We also have the silver butterflies that are connected to Ho Chang, which canonically roughly translate in English to deathly spirit butterflies. But I do find it interesting that out of all the insects that could have potentially been chosen, the insect with the most connection to rebirth and second chances was what was chosen to greet Shilian before his first meeting with Ho Chang, and even technically during it. I'm gonna get back to the actual meaning of Ho Chang's different names because I feel that there is a decent amount to unpack there. But first, I want to focus in on both Shilian and Ho Chang's respective weapons, Ming and Ruoye. Okay, so this is another instance where I might be seeing things that aren't actually there, but bear with me. So I'm either making things up or I'm really late on the uptake, probably the latter, but it's only something that I really thought about and realized as I was scripting this video, and that is the connection between both Ho Chang and Shi Lian's weapons and the sacrifices that they had to make in order to be able to continue living. Shi Lian gave up full access to his spiritual powers, being shackled and bound in order to be able to continue living, while his weapon of choice, Ruye, is technically a binding cloth. Meanwhile, Ho Chang had to give up his eye in order to be able to escape Mount Tonglu and return to Shi Lian. That eye was then literally used to forge the weapon that became known as a Ming. And thus, I think that Ruye and Ming are the clearest symbols of the sacrifices that both Shi Lian and Ho Chang had to make in order to keep on fighting and surviving. If the symbolism was indeed intended, I feel that this symbolism could be taken as a very clear example of symbolism not needing to be obscured and hidden in order to still be effective. Now, going back to Ho Chang's name, or should I say names, Ho Chang's name is chosen, so there is a definite symbolism to be had there. The characters for Ho Chang's name mean flower and city/wall, which to me is both a nod towards how he and Shi Lian originally met, but then like my brain went off and was like, oh, and it's like Ho Chang is the wall that is protecting the flower, aka Shi Lian. But anyway, so that is the official translation, is the fact that it's in reference to the first time that he and Shi Lian met when he was saved by Shi Lian on the palace wall. And that leads me to my next point in the form of Ho Chang's second name, and that is, if symbolism is ingrained deeply enough into your story, then it could lead your audience into making up their own interpretations of symbolism, creating symbolism where you might even not have intended it originally. So the reason why I want to focus in on San Lang as my example for inspiring extra theories and symbolism where there might not have been any is because the general theorization on San Lang's name is the following. Lang means man, but can also be a term of endearment when attached to a name. It can be used by a woman to address their husband or lover, akin to dear. And then the San is the Chinese character for 3, so third, master, husband, you know, that kind of thing. A lot of people agree that Ho Chang probably chose this in order to tease Shi Lian by kind of making him call him dear. And other people speculate that the reason for the number 3 is because he is one of the 3 supremes and a young master of the ghost realm. But then I couldn't help looking at San, the number 3, and trying to think of it through the most romantic lens in the way that I could almost feel Ho Chang might have done. And this is where I feel like unintentional symbolism could come into it. I feel that Ho Chang took the name San Lang because it is only during this time in his life that he is able to approach Shi Lian as an equal. He had to wait 3 lifetimes to do it. He could not do it while he was a human. He could not do it for the very, very brief moment that he was a heavenly official. So he could only do it the 3rd time round when he met Shi Lian as a ghost. Now, whether or not my insane theory is actually valid is beside the point, because I hope that what I've made clear through this demonstration is the fact that because there are so many other beautifully thought out symbolic moments throughout the books, it's very easy for you to come up with your own interpretations and theories about things, which I think engages a reader more and could also add potential depth and value during a reread, for example. Wow, okay, I think that might have been one of the longest sections, but we are finally moving on to themes and parallels. So with regards to theme, there are 2 approaches to theme that I want to point out, starting with the general approach basically. Firstly, in Grandmaster, there seems to be the theme of sacrificing something for someone without their consent. This is a very specific theme, but it's one that can be seen demonstrated in multiple ways. We firstly see it in Jiang Chang sacrificing himself for Wei Wuxian and losing his golden core as a result. And we see Wei Wuxian sacrificing his golden core for Jiang Chang in return, which results in a rift between them. We also see it in the Wens deciding to sacrifice themselves for Wei Wuxian. Though these sacrifices breed a lot of strife for the characters, I do feel like MXTX is not saying, oh, communication would have fixed everything, but more something to the effect of taking the choice away from people, or making a sacrifice for people might not always be well received. And if that sacrifice isn't made selflessly, it could breed regret and resentment. Similarly, Heaven Official's Blessing seems to have a theme that sacrificing something that isn't yours to sacrifice will lead to misery for all involved. We have multiple examples of this, starting with the revelation of how the Windmaster became a heavenly official simply because his brother stole someone else's good fortune and sacrifice them for the sake of the Windmaster. We also see it with Xuanji, who is willing to sacrifice her country for someone, not caring about the damage it would lead to. And ultimately, again, it leads to misery for all involved. Hand in hand with this theme is the sentiment that just because something is yours to sacrifice, it doesn't mean that you'll be rewarded for it in the end. Xuanji sacrifices many things that are technically hers to give, her legs, her freedom, but because these sacrifices weren't wanted, it ultimately again leads to suffering for her and others as well. In both a Grandmaster and Heaven Official's Blessing, there's also the theme of survival. We see it in Wei Wuxian surviving the burial mounds after losing his golden core. We see it in Shi Lian surviving his first and second descension, and in Hua Cheng being willing to give up his eye in order to have a fighting chance. We even see it in minor characters such as the human who was buried as fertilizer, becoming inhumane in order to survive. It's a look at the darkness that people can descend to in order to survive, as well as the light and hope that people might cling to for the very same purpose. The next theme that I feel is present in both Grandmaster and Heaven Officials is the theme that loyalty should be given freely, not forced. We see the failed loyalty between Xiaoxing Chen and Xu Ya, as well as General Pei and Xuan Ji, which is then contrasted with the unselfish loyalty between Wei Wuxian and Lang Wangji and Shi Lian and Hua Cheng. And again, hand in hand with this theme is the theme of selflessness versus selfishness. We not only see this with Xiaoxing Chen and Xu Ya and General Pei and Xuan Ji, but also in the relationship, in my opinion, with Meng Yao and Lan Xichen. While Meng Yao and Lan Xichen's relationship mirrors Lang Wangji and Wei Wuxian's relationship in some regard, it's very clear by the end of the novel that unfortunately Lan Xichen and Meng Yao's relationship lack the selflessness that Lang Wangji and Wei Wuxian's relationship has, because unfortunately by the end of the novel it's made quite clear that Meng Yao doesn't mind hurting people connected to Lan Xichen. His only bottom line is that he won't hurt Lan Xichen. In contrast, Lang Wangji, even when he disagrees with the people surrounding Wei Wuxian, aka Jiang Chang, he would never even think of hurting Jiang Chang because he knows how important Jiang Chang is to Wei Wuxian. Similarly, Hua Cheng never makes his care for Shi Lian's problem. He never pushes past Shi Lian's boundaries of comfort, and he always prioritizes Shi Lian's needs above his own desires, in comparison to Xuan Ji's willingness to trap General Pei just to satiate her own needs. Now, am I saying General Pei is a saint? I just want to put this disclaimer because it feels like I've been coming up for General Pei, and I very much am not. Am I saying he's a saint? Hell no. But yeah, that's unfortunately neither here nor there with regards to the symbolism. The next approach to theme is the statement of theme within a memorable quote. This is probably my favorite approach to theme, but I think it's also one of the hardest ones to do while keeping the quote not too preachy, natural, fitting, and memorable. So even though I think there are multiple instances of this happening in all of the novels, I want to look at one each from Grandmaster and Heaven Officials. So the chosen memorable quote from Grandmaster for me is walking on a single planked bridge. To me, there is a nice theme summed up in walking a single planked bridge. I can only really describe it as walking a difficult path on your own because you know it's the right thing to do. The theme itself is beautifully worded and really feels like it's encapsulated in these words. At face value, obviously, this originates from Wei Wuxian having to walk a very difficult journey on his own while trying to save the winds from the fury of the rest of the cultivation world. Attached to that is also him walking without a clan, without a home, and without his golden core. But what I do like is that upon a second read through, to me in a sense, it could also be applied to Lang Wangji, because even though it seems as if he is walking on a wide open road with people all around him and everyone approving of his actions, it's clear in hindsight that he at the same time is struggling with his decisions that he needs to make and where his loyalties lie, what his heart is telling him to do versus what his sect is telling him to do. Wei Wuxian might be alone on a single planked bridge, but similarly Lang Wangji is alone in a wide open space. Moving on to Heaven Official's Blessing, the important quote that I chose for this one is probably not going to surprise anyone, but it is body in abyss, heart in paradise. And what I take this to mean is basically staying kind and well-intentioned even in your darkest time. And what I love about this is that it not only applies to both the main characters, but also to one of the side characters who I love. Shilian ascends thrice, but during his second ascension, he is in a very dark place, and because of that, he descends again. While he's descended for the second time, he remains kind and well-intentioned, and so is able to ascend the third time as well. Then we have Huo Cheng, and putting aside the fact that to me his heart will always be in paradise while his body is in abyss, aka the ghost realm, because Shilian is his heart and his heart is staying in paradise. Putting that aside for a moment, we have Huo Cheng literally being in the abyss, being at Mount Tonglu in the midst of basically almost losing himself. But because his heart remains true to his mission of returning to Shilian and keeping the humans in Mount Tonglu safe, he manages to pull through in the end. Lastly, we have the theme symbolized in the Windmaster as well, in my opinion, because though we start out knowing him with both his heart and body metaphorically in paradise, because of the events of the novel, he ends up in the human realm and experiencing a lot of hardship, and despite all of that, he does push through and end up coming out stronger on the other side, in my opinion. Much like with the symbolism, there is many more themes to unpack with this, but what I hope I've been able to illustrate with these few examples is the fact that the themes are only as effective as they are because MXTX knows her own intentions with these themes. Not only that, but she allows these themes to be explored by multiple of the characters within each of her stories, which means that not only are these themes allowed to be fleshed out, but they get to be explored from multiple different angles. Okay, so it is day 5 and we are on to the final stretch of the video. We're starting off with a section of rapid fire things that I noticed but that I didn't feel warranted necessarily a full section on its own. So here we go. So firstly we have the humor, and to me it's very clear that MXTX is aware of her strengths within her writing as well as what she enjoys writing, and the humor for me is very much something that interacts with every single other element of her books. And what I think is clever about it is, if, like I suspect, she's very aware of the fact that this is part of her writer's voice, she not only uses that to incorporate it into the character voice, but also to make the characters more likable and in some cases more relatable as well. Now obviously this isn't going to be a one size fits all. We can't all copy MXTX's humor just to make our characters likable, especially in cases where you're working with an anti-hero or even a straight up villain. But I do think there's something to be said with knowing what your strengths are, analyzing them, and seeing how your own strengths in writing can potentially help you connect the audience more to your characters. The next thing to note is the character voice that shines through even within the normal writing and not just within moments of thought or dialogue. MXTX has always had quite a good grasp, in my opinion, on baking the character voice into the writing style and not just restricting it to the character thoughts itself. Now obviously she still uses character thoughts to convey information and characterize the writing, but I feel she has a good balance of both within all her works. So firstly we have an example from Scum Villain. Internally, Shenjin Chia tissed and lamented, as expected for classic canon fodder, versus what could you do though? The ultimate boss in the book was the protagonist himself. How could a firefly outshine the sun and moon? Another thing that she does is she tries to balance things going well in one side of the story with things going badly in another side of the story. A lot of the times it will be in the form of it going well in the plot versus going bad emotionally, or vice versa. Apart from the bigger plot points where the physical plot and the emotional plot beats are in lockstep with each other, MXTX has quite the tendency to pair emotionally heavy scenes with more plot light scenes, or alternatively plot heavy scenes with emotionally almost soothing scenes, in a way that in my opinion helps keep the audience from experiencing emotional or plot fatigue. So with regards to Scum Villain, at the start Shenjin Chia figures out that he has transmigrated, and he's taking this news surprisingly well. So in terms of emotionality, it feels quite lighthearted and, you know, oh, this is the start of a new adventure, that kind of thing, until the plot comes into play. Within the dark, gloomy room, a metal chain hung from a beam. At the end of the chain dangled a ring. The ring was fastened around a person's waist, if it could still be considered a person. This person's appearance was filthy and disheveled, like that of a madman. The most frightening thing about him was that all 4 of his limbs had been severed. His shoulders and thighs were only 4 bare knobs of flesh. When touched, he would let out a hoarse ah sound. His tongue had been torn out too, rendering him unable to form complete words. With Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation's example, it basically happens in reverse. It starts off with a plot-heavy moment of Wei Wuxian being accused of murder, but from Wei Wuxian's perspective, it's emotionally rather light. Thus, when those large hands came to drag him out the door, Wei Wuxian lay there limply, allowing himself to be dragged out. It saved him the trouble anyway. Alternatively, in Grandmaster, when the plot stakes seem rather low and the emotions rather high, we have this. So he countered, "Didn't your mother teach you any manners?" Raging flames of fury flashed in the youth's eyes. He pulled the long sword from his back and glowered. Similarly, we have this scene at the end of Heaven Official's Blessing, Volume 1. It was the same pot Benyu was tucked in. Shilian had casually placed it next to the mat, but somehow it had tipped itself over and rolled to the door. Blocked by the wooden door built by Hua Cheng, it started hitting the door by rolling into it repeatedly. Shilian was worried it might break itself, so he opened the door, and the little clay pot rolled into the grass field outside. Shilian followed behind it and saw that once the little clay pot made it to the grass field, it stood itself upright. Even if it was only a pot, it gave the impression that it was gazing at the night sky. Again, even though physically the plot is quite talking heavy, it's not really moving at a rapid pace or anything like that, there's this undercurrent of sadness in the emotionality of the scene, in my opinion. Okay, so I know I have been talking a lot so far, but we're almost done. The endings are truly some of the best in my opinion, because unlike with most traditional novels, we get two kinds of endings. There's the normal one where all the general loose ends are tied up, aka Wei Wuxian being reunited with Wen Yun, and Huo Cheng and Shilian having a reunion dinner with some of the beloved characters in the rebuilt Puchi Shrine, as well as a final reveal about Huo Cheng's tattoo. But then we also get extras. For those that might not be aware, in web novels it's quite common to have extra chapters after the initial end that touch on things that fans might be curious about but aren't absolutely necessary to read for the context of the rest of the story. This includes things like Lang Wanji preparing the food for a banquet and making sure that there is food that Wei Wuxian would like to eat, or Huo Cheng and Shilian having a very cute date during a lantern festival in Ghost City. These extras make for a wonderful ending, as it not only allows the fans more time before parting with the story, it also gives them a peek into what happens after the traditional ending of the story. The type of things that fans would usually have to speculate about if they wanted a complete picture. Now obviously not every story can have multiple extra chapters in order to satisfy the audience, and many times it's not appropriate, especially in traditional literature, but to me it does give some food for thought in terms of not just including the absolute bare minimum in order to finish up your story. It might be worth considering what is that one extra element that you could add to the end of your story that would satisfy the fans and that would leave them less satisfied if it had been excluded. In my opinion, sometimes it's worth it adding that little extra detail that's not absolutely necessary to your story, but that would definitely add to the fans' enjoyment, kind of like a cherry on top of a cake approach. With that said, I do want to take a look at the way that With all that said, I do want to take a look at the way that MXTX decided to end both Grandmaster and Heaven Official's Blessing, the extras excluded, because as most people would probably agree, the ending outside of the beginning to me is kind of the most important part. With Grandmaster, the ending is as follows. Wei Wuxian was calling him with a smile on his lips. Just as he always had, Lang Wanji looked at him, and forever after, his eyes could never move away from him again. My heart. But anyway, with Heaven Official's Blessing, there is kind of two endings. Let me first talk about what I would almost consider to be the folk tale ending to their story, which is an addition that I absolutely love and that I think is very appropriate for the kind of story that Heaven Official's Blessing is. It ends with what could almost be considered the slogan of the novel as a whole. By the Heaven Official's Blessing, no paths are bound. The ending from Shilian and Huo Cheng's perspective, however, is as follows. Although it was soundless, Shilian still knew exactly what he said. It was the words that Huo Cheng had enforced since he was a child, eternally thereafter beyond his death. I am forever your most devoted believer. And I do have to apologize, but this quote specifically I had to get from an unofficial translation of the work, because the final volume of Heaven Official's Blessing is not yet released as of me scripting and posting this, so sorry about that. At face value, to me, these are already some of the most romantic ending lines that I have ever read, but looking beyond that, I do think there is so much more to it. I'm gonna try very hard not to cry at the end of this, because I cried while writing the script for it. It's so silly. But anyway, it's interesting to me that for novels that are mainly from Wei Wuxian and Shi Lian's perspectives, these final two lines seem to actually come from both Lang Wangji and Huo Chang's perspectives. They are the quiet supporters who have held up the two main characters from the start to the end of this novel. Not only does it encapsulate the love that they have for their respective partners, but the very words and sentiments used within these final phrases points to what it is that basically carried the weight of the romantic arc of each of these novels. It was Lang Wangji seeing Wuxian for who he truly is, even when he himself was wavering, and Huo Chang never losing faith in Shi Lian, even when Shi Lian lost faith in himself. To me, this is what makes the endings of these stories truly impactful. It's because, much like with the start of each of these novels, the endings capture the very essence of the story in its entirety. And I think this is where I'm going to end it. I have to admit that even after 20-something pages and I don't know how many hours of video footage later, I still don't feel like I really did MXTX's work any justice. And I have to say I am quite disappointed in myself that I wasn't able to finish Scum Villain in time for this video. But if I had to wait for that, this video would probably take another year to produce. Nonetheless, I hope you guys still enjoyed the little bit that I was able to cover and that there were maybe some helpful insights along the way. If you did manage to stick around until the end, thank you so much. This is something that I have absolutely no idea how it's going to be received, but I put a lot of heart into it. So I hope you guys did enjoy it. I hope you guys have an amazing day, and otherwise I'll see you in the next one. 再见.